What is it that makes someone a legend? What is it about their lives that catapults the rare few to greatness? It's difficult to say, but in all of history, there is only a handful of truly great figures, and none was greater than Napoleon Bonaparte. This is the tomb of the most famous ruler in the world, one of the most interesting and complex men who ever lived, and one of my favorite people. Napoleon Bonaparte's buried in there. There are more books written about Napoleon than any other man in history. But you don't get to be that famous just by being a great general. He was a genius, interested in everything: art, literature, mathematics. You know our system of numbering houses? Odd numbers on one side of the street, even on the other? That was Napoleon's idea. But in spite of his fame, there's a mystery year in his life that practically no one knows about. But it's when a young general became Napoleon the Great. It was a year that changed the world. Our story begins 200 years ago in Egypt, a land virtually unknown to Europeans of that time. This was a country that had lost touch with its glorious past, its vast temples and monuments shrouded in mystery, its ancient writings indecipherable. The Egypt of Napoleon's day was an Islamic country. The skyline of its capital, Cairo, filled with the mosques and minarets of the faithful. Bonaparte was only 29 and had just amazed the world with his military victories in Italy. He intended to establish his fame and glory by conquering Egypt. But why Egypt? Well, France was at war with Britain, and by conquering Egypt, Napoleon would block the trade routes to Britain's most valuable possession, India. There was another motive as well. Bonaparte was hungry for a new challenge. Europe, he wrote, is a molehill. Everything wears out. My glory is already past, and this tiny Europe does not offer enough of it. We must go to the east. All great glory has always been gained there. Seeking fame and glory, Napoleon would follow in the footsteps of his hero, Alexander the Great. He would sail for Egypt, that exotic land that for centuries had remained isolated from the Western world. After weeks at sea, the French landed near Alexandria, then a sleepy seaport, and they captured the city with little resistance. The country wasn't even ruled by Egyptians, but by Mameluke warriors who had seized control of Egypt. In the 13th century, the Egyptian Sultan bought 12,000 young slave boys, Mamelukes, from the Caucasus Mountains near Armenia, and trained them for an elite fighting corps. The Mamelukes soon overthrew the Sultan and had ruled from Cairo ever since. Soon, Bonaparte would have to fight them, but that was easier said than done. This is the Egyptian desert. It's hot, very hot. It goes up to 130 degrees in summer. Tourists are advised to wear a hat, light clothing, and drink a quart of water every hour. Bonaparte arrived in July. His men had heavy woolen uniforms and no water bottles. Why? Because Bonaparte was an amazing contradiction. He could manage minute details of his campaign, was a great strategist, but when he wanted something, he just wanted it. And now he wanted Cairo, which was 130 miles away. So he took his army, marched them through the desert with no accurate map, inadequate supplies, and hardly any water. Napoleon was economical with almost everything, except the lives of his men. As they marched across the desert, the heat was unbearable, and the troops began to strip off their uniforms. Crazed by the heat and lack of water, many dumped their rations. Who could eat dry biscuits when dying of thirst? The dust parched their throats and the sand burned their feet as the soldiers marched toward Cairo. To add to their misery, lakes and ponds shimmered on the distant horizon when none were there. The soldiers called them mirages, literally visions. Tormented by the prospect of water, only to find it was an illusion, some men lost their wits and committed suicide. When wells were found, they were emptied in minutes. Sergeant Francois wrote, "More than 30 soldiers died by those wells." When the soldiers finally reached the Nile, they broke ranks and threw themselves into the water. Some jumped in with their clothes and weapons, floating and swimming for hours, drinking as much as they could. Then they gorged themselves with watermelons from nearby fields. By the time they reached Cairo, many had dysentery. It was 3 weeks since the army left the Egyptian coast, and now they prepared for battle. The Mameluke battle line was drawn about a mile from the French. Behind them loomed the Great Pyramids. To the left, the mosques glittered on the skyline of Cairo. At 2 p.m., during the worst heat of the day, the French army prepared to engage the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes were no ordinary cavalrymen. An elite and proud fighting corps, they were unafraid of death. They believed they would go straight to paradise if they died in battle. Their tombs were large and elaborate. Bonaparte ordered his divisions to arrange themselves into the well-known square formation. Rifles at the outside, baggage and cavalry inside, and the artillery at the outer corners. The Battle of the Pyramids was unlike any other. For the first time in history, a European professional army would clash with the elite Oriental fighting class. It could have been billed as East meets West. The Mamelukes were fresh and confident. Their costumes were exotic, armed with daggers, rifles, battle axes and pistols. The Mamelukes were a formidable sight. Napoleon always knew how to inspire his men. Pointing to the pyramids, he shouted, "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon us." The Mameluke cavalry charged the French squares. The disciplined French troops waited until the Mamelukes were almost upon them and met the charge with devastating firepower. The attack was repeated again with the same result. Mameluke corpses littered the battlefield. To the victor belongs the spoils, and the French were determined to collect. From the fallen Mamelukes, they stripped the jewels, gold, silver, and gathered up the fine weapons. This was their reward for all their suffering. Things were looking up. Bonaparte had conquered Egypt. Let me tell you a neat detail about the Battle of the Pyramids. It was fought here, at Mbaba, in a melon patch. The pyramids are over there. Look at them. They're miles away. You see, Napoleon was concerned about how he'd go down in history. So he always gave his battles dramatic names. Battle of Mbaba, not so catchy. Battle of the Melon Patch, that's worse. So history knows it as the Battle of the Pyramids. Bonaparte had captured Cairo, and his officers happily moved into the palaces vacated by the retreating Mamelukes, sometimes even inheriting their harems. But in a sense, the Cairo of 200 years ago was two cities. There was the Cairo of the masses, teeming with bustling bazaars that offered exotic products of every kind, from frankincense and myrrh to fezzes. Craftsmen made baskets, rugs, pottery. The French soldiers were fascinated by the covered markets and traded buttons from their uniforms for goods. Besides the strange and wonderful wares of the